In this video, we're going to take sort of a little bit of a look at environmental ethics. This is only one aspect of environmental ethics, and we'll just sort of give a quick overview of some of the most popular approaches and some of the problems that show up for environmental ethics, at least this aspect of environmental ethics. So here we've got some goals of environmentalists. So some of them are obvious, right? So the ones at the bottom here, right? Reducing pollution, increasing sustainability, sustainable practices of all kinds, reducing the amount of materials that we're using, recycling them, reusing them, and so on. Preserving especially rare species and endangered habitats, but really all species and all habitats are what environmentalists are interested in. Certainly keeping the natural environment as free from human influence as possible, and as free from human development as possible, because of course, humans are interested in extracting resources from the environment. And so we're using the environment in potentially very destructive ways. And of course, environmentalism is trying to push back against that. So here's some obvious examples, right? Clear cutting in the Pacific Northwest for lumber, open pit mining for things like rare earth minerals. This is sort of a strip mining. This is the Alberta tar sands in the bottom right here. So it's sort of strip mining for fossil fuels, and then just general pollution in an urban environment. Clearly, environmentalists are opposed to all of these things. So then the question is, although it sort of makes intuitive sense for the environmentalists and all of us, whether you self-identify as an environmentalist or not, it seems to make intuitive sense that these things are good to oppose, right? There's good reasons for opposing these destructive practices, but we have to ask, what are the specific arguments in favor of the environmentalist goals? And then how strong are those arguments? So here's one pretty straightforward, obvious argument that you might give to somebody, say somebody who's claims to not be interested in environmentalism at all. They say, why should I worry about any of these kinds of things? Who cares? Why do I need to change my own life to reduce, reuse, and recycle, or reduce my own personal carbon footprint or whatnot? And so an environmentalist might present them with an argument something like this, right? We want to survive. We think of ourselves as valuables. Whether we think just all humans are valuable or you yourself just consider your own personal self to be valuable, either way, that works for this argument because we all rely on the natural environment for our survival one way or another. Certainly the large-scale nutrient cycling in order to provide us with the basics, oxygen, keeping carbon dioxide from building up too much, all of those sorts of basic things. We rely on the natural environment for survival. We want to be able to have clean air, drinkable water, edible food that doesn't have nasty contaminations in it. All of those things. This is pretty obvious. You take any basic biology class and it becomes obvious that we rely on the natural environment for our survival. So therefore, if we want to survive, we need to preserve the environment. Pretty straightforward. But of course, one of the potential problems here is that this doesn't say that we can't use the environment for any resource extraction, or we can't use it for any kind of sort of urban sprawl or sort of taking over open space and taking over natural environments for more human development. It just says that we need a functioning environment in order for us to survive. So this might be an argument against sort of widespread complete destruction of the environment, but there's still a lot of smaller scale projects that could still be allowed by this argument, but would be opposed by environmentalists. The other thing to notice here is that this argument assumes, first of all, I mentioned this, that humans are intrinsically valuable. We are valuable. We'll get to what it means to be intrinsically valuable in a second, versus the environment that's extrinsically valuable. So what do we mean by that? To be intrinsically valuable, or just intrinsically good, intrinsically morally important, means that it's good or valuable in and of itself. Just the thing itself is intrinsically valuable. It is a valuable thing. So you might say, humans are intrinsically valuable. That's kind of a default assumption that a lot of people have, whether they've really thought it through or not. we assume that humans, or maybe just yourself, you are intrinsically valuable. You are a valuable thing one way or another, versus being extrinsically valuable. So an extrinsically valuable thing is only valuable insofar as it helps to lead to or promote or maximize intrinsic value. That is, promote or lead to or maximize something or things that have intrinsic value. So a classic example of something that has only extrinsic value is money. Money completely on its own, like if you're stranded on a deserted island and you had a big pile of money, like that money isn't really valuable. The money itself isn't valuable. It's only valuable insofar as you can use that money to get something that you actually want. And maybe that sort of leads you to preserving yourself or preserving something else that's got intrinsic value. So examples of things that have intrinsic value, I already mentioned, maybe humans, maybe just life itself is intrinsically valuable, or we might say happiness is intrinsically valuable. If you just think about happiness itself, forgetting about why somebody might feel happy or what the happiness is going to lead to, just isolating the feeling of happiness all by itself, it just is a good thing. It's a positive thing. So this is why philosophers often think that happiness might be intrinsically valuable. So let's go back to this argument. Yes, this argument can go a long way to promoting environmentalist goals, but it does assume that humans are the things that are intrinsically valuable, whereas the natural environment itself is merely extrinsically valuable. It's only valuable insofar as it's helping us. And environmentalists would want to take this a step further and try to come up with arguments that show that in addition to being extrinsically valuable, that is helping us, there's some intrinsic value in the environment itself. So that the environment is worth preserving for its own sake, not merely as a way to help us. So if we have an argument that shows that, that's successful in showing that, then even if we can see that we can extract resources from the environment without completely destroying it, there still might be reasons to hold off and say like, no, we would actually be destroying intrinsic value in the environment itself. So even though we can see that we can help ourselves by extracting resources from the environment, we shouldn't do that. Or at least it would be morally wrong to do that. That's sort of the goal here. Okay, so one super famous ethical theory that I talk about in another video, so I won't go too deep into it here, is utilitarianism. So just the basics of utilitarianism, it assumes that the main and perhaps the only intrinsically valuable thing there is happiness. And the only intrinsically bad thing is suffering. So it really focuses on how much happiness and suffering do we cause by our actions. And of course, we should do whatever will do the best work of maximizing total happiness in the world, in the universe, and minimizing the total amount of suffering that exists. And so anything that can feel happiness and suffering should be taken into account when thinking about the consequences of our actions. And certainly humans can feel happiness and suffering, there's not much dispute there, but utilitarianism doesn't really care who's feeling the happiness and suffering. It just is all about those feelings themselves, those conscious states of experience of happiness and suffering. And it seems like we have really good reasons for thinking that there's a lot of different kinds of animals, at least, that can feel happiness and suffering. Their behaviors, their central nervous systems, and so on give us good reasons for thinking that most mammals probably can feel happiness and suffering, maybe a lot of birds, maybe reptiles, fish, there's at least a lot of vertebrates and maybe some invertebrates that can feel happiness and suffering. So they need to be taken into account when making our decisions here. So there are wild animals, that is animals living in the natural environment that can feel happiness. And so this shows us that there is some intrinsic value in the environment, that is the happiness being felt by these wild animals. So this leads to a fairly straightforward utilitarian argument in favor of environmentalism. Many animals in the wild are sentient, that is, they can feel happiness and suffering. Disruption of their environment increases their suffering and decreases their happiness, whereas preserving their natural habitats can promote their happiness and reduce their suffering, at least the amount of happiness and suffering that could be caused by us. So therefore, we should avoid destroying the natural environment, avoid destroying their habitats, and try to promote policies that preserve these natural habitats. So this goes at least part of the way towards establishing that there actually is intrinsic value in the environment and we should try to preserve it. Okay, so that seems nice, but there are some limitations to this argument. It perhaps doesn't do sort of everything that environmentalists would want it to do. So let's look at some of the potential pitfalls or limitations, at least, of the utilitarian argument in favor of environmentalism. So one thing could be there might be some particular project, whether it's a new housing project or it's a resource extraction project, that would lead to a whole bunch of human happiness or reduce a whole bunch of human suffering, but really not have that much of an effect on the sentient animals that are living in that environment or that particular habitat that we're interested in. And so in that case, when we add up sort of the total amount of happiness and suffering that would be caused by developing some piece of the natural environment for our own purposes, it could turn out that the utilitarian argument says, yep, looks like we will maximize happiness and minimize suffering by going ahead and extracting those resources or developing this new housing complex or whatever it might be. So that's something that, environmentalists would be opposed to that practice. But if they're going to rely on utilitarianism, they might have to acknowledge that some projects are actually still worth doing. Okay, so there's that. Then the other thing is that there's a whole bunch of things in the natural environment that are not sentient, that do not feel happiness and suffering. So, for example, there, individual trees. We don't have good reason for thinking that they feel happiness and suffering. So, if we're going to cut down trees and extract the lumber, but we know that we won't be affecting many or maybe no sentient animals by doing that, well, then the utilitarian argument says that might be okay. Right? We're not going to decrease happiness or increase suffering by doing that because we're not affecting any sentient animals. And then certainly the non-living parts of the environment are environmentalists are concerned with preserving those as well. So mountains themselves or the rivers themselves, glaciers, sand dunes, oceans, the atmosphere, all of these kinds of things that environmentalists are concerned with sort of preserving or certainly concerned with not destroying or not kind of corrupting through our human use of them. But those things don't feel any happiness and suffering, so they don't come into the utilitarian considerations in any direct way. So that's a limitation as well. And then interestingly, whole species, right? So environmentalists are not just concerned with preserving individual animals, they're concerned with preserving an entire species of animal. And so there's a little bit of a complication there because even if individual members of a species can feel happiness and suffering, there's no additional happiness and suffering felt at the species level. A species doesn't feel anything, even if individual members of the species could feel things. So that's a potential limitation here as well. And we can extend that to whole ecosystems. Certainly environmentalists want to preserve intact, functioning ecosystems. But an ecosystem doesn't feel anything. Again, even though individual animals that are living in that ecosystem and are part of that ecosystem might feel happiness and suffering, the ecosystem at all doesn't feel anything. So again, this is a bit of a limitation of the utilitarian support for environmentalist goals. Just one other thing to say, kind of on the same line of thought, that environmentalists want to preserve especially endangered species, right? So if a species has very low numbers, just a few hundred or maybe 1,000 individuals, then we want to put extra effort, extra resources into preserving that species in particular. But according to utilitarianism, it doesn't really matter if an animal is a member of a rare species. Rarity doesn't increase the importance of your happiness or your suffering. So let's say there's a species where there's only a couple hundred individuals left. Well, a couple hundred individuals, their happiness and suffering, that matters, but it's really only a small amount of happiness and suffering compared to the humongous amount of happiness and suffering happening in the world overall. So from just the straightforward utilitarian approach, it's not clear that we should be putting so much resources into preserving, for example, pandas. It's like, how much happiness and suffering are we working with pandas compared to how much happiness we could promote or how much suffering we could reduce with those millions of dollars that we use to preserve pandas or California condors, right? Lots and lots of resources to trying to support California condors when it's not clear how much happiness we're really promoting by doing that or how much suffering we're preventing by doing that, yet we're spending, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in this project. So this isn't to say that those projects are bad or not worthy somehow. It's just that it's not clear that the utilitarian approach can adequately support those environmentalist goals. So they might need some other approach. All right, we're not done harping on utilitarianism yet. There's always a lot to say about utilitarianism, but it's got this other problem. Sometimes we could call this sort of a motivation problem in utilitarianism. So, for example, environmentalists want us to change our personal behaviors. For example, make sure that you're reducing and reusing and recycling your materials. So that's, I've gotten used to that. A lot of us have gotten used to kind of following those guidelines, but it is a little extra work, maybe not a ton of extra work, but it is extra work to make sure that you're separating out your recyclables and making sure they're going to the right places and so on, and reducing the amount of materials you're using, say like not driving your car as much to reduce your carbon footprint and all those sorts of things. So that's a little bit of a burden on us as individuals to change our lifestyle, to change our behaviors, to accommodate what the environmentalists want us to do, right? And so then if we're thinking about the utilitarian point of view here to sort of support that behavior change, I might ask, like, so how much happiness am I really promoting by driving my car less, or making sure that I recycle my plastics and my glass and my paper and my metals? How much happiness do I personally really promote by doing that? Or from the other point of view, how much suffering do I personally actually cause by failing to do those things? I go ahead and drive my car when I feel like it, or I just don't bother separating out my recyclables and I just throw it all in the landfill. Like, okay, that's what I'm not supposed to do, right? That's sort of a sin of environmentalism. But how much suffering do I actually really cause by doing that? And arguably, it's really a very small amount of suffering that I cause by failing to recycle my plastics, for example. So I might say, like, this is a big burden on me to change my lifestyle and go to all this bother of accommodating what the environmentalists are telling me to do for very microscopic, we might say, consequences that I'm getting out of this. A very small reduction in suffering, a very small increase in happiness by doing this. So what's my motivation? It seems like I don't really have the significant consequences by doing this, so I won't bother doing it. I won't bother following environmentalist guidelines. And this might sound familiar, this kind of argument. Similar thing shows up in voting, right? So it's like my vote doesn't really count for much of anything, really, just my individual vote. It's a little bit of a bother for me to go through the process of making sure my vote is cast and recorded and so on. So what's my motivation for actually doing this? And so this is a limitation of utilitarianism here, because although as an individual I might not have much impact, but if everybody follows this line of reasoning, then we have a really big impact. So it has a trouble dealing with these things that have kind of this collective responsibility or collective consequences, whereas an individual has very little responsibility and very little consequences. So from the individual level, we have a motivation problem. Okay, so here's another approach. We might say that, so setting aside utilitarianism now and kind of moving on to a different approach to supporting environmentalist goals, we might say that things in the environment have a right to be there somehow or another. And human disruption of the environment violates their right to live or just to exist in the environment. So we shouldn't do that because it's a rights violation. So it's not about what consequences we have in terms of happiness and suffering. It's like, no, unless we have a really, really strong overriding reason, we should respect the rights of the things that exist in the environment, in the natural environment. Well, this is potentially a powerful approach if it's established that something has a right to exist in a particular place at a particular time. Well, then, like I said, we need very significant reasons for overriding that right. So this could be a powerful approach. The problem, though, is while it's already a little bit controversial about, do humans have natural rights? That's an active debate in philosophy. But if we try to extend this to non-human things, then it gets even more debatable. It gets more contentious. So do non-human things, especially non-sentient, non-conscious things, do they have rights? Does a tree have a right to live in the woods, to live in a forest? Does a mountain have a right to not be mined? Does a river have a right to not be diverted so that its water is diverted for agricultural use, for example? Or does a river have a right to not have pollutants dumped into that river? Or a lake to have a right to not have pollutants dumped into the lake? This is dubious, right? It's very difficult to extend this notion of rights to include all of those sorts of things. There are some interesting legal cases. You can Google them, rights of a river, rights of a lake. There have been some attempts to establish legal rights for those things, but those are spotty success at best. Okay. Here's another one. This one's a little vague. It's not clear exactly what ethical theory this is relying on, but you might hear an argument that's something like this, that natural things that are natural, have just sort of an automatic, natural, intrinsic value to them. And that's different than artificial things. Artificial things, they're built by humans, and so they're just not as valuable as natural things. So natural things, objects and processes in the natural environment, are different than artificial things. Natural things are inherently more valuable, more intrinsically valuable than artificial things. So we should always favor the natural things. We should try not to disrupt natural objects and processes with our artificial ones. Okay, sort of an intuitively plausible argument, perhaps, but we've got some problems. Right? So for the first premise there, is it really true that natural objects are fundamentally different than artificial things? So this is problematic, right? The distinction between natural and artificial might be kind of hard to support. So for example, we might say, oh, houses, so this place that I'm living in, artificial. And it's a disruption of the natural environment that otherwise would be here. So I'm disrupting the natural environment with this artificial home that I'm in now. Okay, well, are humans the only things that build homes? Of course not. There's all kinds of animals that live in the natural environment. It's completely uncontroversial that those animals are natural and that they're building sort of natural homes for themselves, whether it's a nest or it's a beehive or it's a den for wolves or whatever it might be. They're building a home for themselves. So why is it that human homes are artificial and perhaps bad or not valuable or not as valuable, whereas other species that build homes for themselves, those are natural and they are valuable? Or another example would be like Hoover Dam. We build these huge dams, we block these rivers, that's held up as a really problematic example of human disruption of the natural environment with our artificial stuff. And so we shouldn't do that, according to this argument, right? This argument. But what else builds dams? Okay, well, clearly beavers build dams. But according to this argument, when beavers build dams, that's natural and good. But when humans build dams, that's artificial and not as good, or maybe even actively bad. So we need to do more work in figuring out exactly what is the distinction between natural and unnatural here, natural and artificial, in order for this argument to really work. Plus, humans are part of the natural environment. We've got our fancy technology, so we feel like we've been separated from the natural environment. But we're part of this world, right? We're a species. And so again, we'd have to do more work to show why it is that what humans are doing is somehow fundamentally different. It's not natural. So I don't want to say that that's impossible to establish that distinction between natural and artificial and somehow show that natural is better than artificial. Just saying it takes a lot of work, and it's not clear that there's going to be an uncontroversial conclusion here that natural things are automatically different and better than artificial things. Okay. One more that we can look at, the aesthetic approach. So things in the natural environment have aesthetic value, and human disruption of the natural environment decreases that aesthetic value. So we should avoid doing that. So this is an interesting approach, very different than the other ones. It's pretty obvious. Things in the environment have aesthetic value. Here's a couple, right? The Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, and then this was a coral reef. I think that's off the coast of Belize. Beautiful. There's perhaps some sentient things that are living around the coral reef, but in the Great Sand Dunes, there's a few scattered plants, maybe a few insects, but it's not clear that if we somehow started extracting resources from the sand dunes there, that we would be affecting any sentient animals. And so the utilitarian argument doesn't really kick in there. But we might say it's beautiful. Maybe this picture doesn't do the best job of perfectly capturing it, but it is a beautiful place. So there's aesthetic value there. So there's some good things about the aesthetic approach. For one thing, we mentioned before when we were talking about utilitarianism, that utilitarianism does not favor rare species, but the aesthetic approach does. So the aesthetic approach, if it's not obvious, is borrowed from the aesthetics of artwork. So the aesthetics of art, that is a philosophical tradition that goes back thousands of years, and then relatively recently, in the last few decades, environmental ethicists realized that they could apply some of those arguments and ideas having to do with artworks that could apply that to the environment. And with artwork, the more rare a piece of art is, the more valuable it is. So for example, if it's a lithograph or something that's been printed and reproduced thousands of times, there was thousands of copies made of this one print, that decreases, it sort of dilutes the value of any individual print. But if it's a one of a kind, then that value could be much, much higher. So the more rare something is, the more valuable it is, according to this viewpoint. Also authenticity. So we haven't talked about that really yet, but authenticity can be important. So for example, a natural forest, sort of untouched old growth forest, is more valuable than a human planted orchard, or even if we're trying to replace trees that we harvested and we plant them all in a row or something like that. Sort of there's a sense in which it's not an authentic forest. It's sort of like we put it back together in this way. And so it's more valuable to have sort of untouched, completely natural environment. It's more authentic in that sense, and so therefore more valuable. And of course, that's true in artwork, regular artwork as well. An authentic piece of art is more important than a copy or a reproduction. Okay, maybe it's somewhat clear what the potential problems are here. Aesthetic value is sort of a tricky thing in general. There's a question as to whether it's completely subjective, it's valuable only in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, or if there's some intrinsic value in things that are beautiful or things that are sort of aesthetically good, one way or another. What is aesthetic value? Is it really intrinsic value, or is it extrinsic value? That is, it's only valuable insofar as it sort of makes things like us happy, for example. Then also, even if we can establish that aesthetic value really is intrinsic value, how important is that value compared to other things, like our needs for resources and just to support ourselves and our own lives and well-being? Okay, so that was a whole bunch of talk about environmental ethics. So I think I'll just go ahead and stop there. Thank you.